Thank you everyone for joining us today. Just a quick intro. Henry Yun here. I'm a principal architect here at DynTek. I'm based in Southern California. My focus is primarily developing solutions for our customers in the networking space and more recently in the security space. Today we want to talk to you guys about the threat landscape in the public sector, what they are and what we can do to protect our organizations against these threats. Before we dive in, let's start with setting some expectations, basically what we hope you'll get from the session. First, we want you to understand the security trends in the public sector space and why they're happening. Next, we want to review ways for us to build a better security posture. And lastly, we want to talk about how solutions in the Cisco security portfolio can fill in the gaps. So we want to help you leverage the integrated approach that Cisco brings to the table. So for the majority of the session now, we're going to be talking about ransomware. So I'm sure you guys are all familiar with it. We've been hearing about it in the news at a pretty frequent and consistent clip. One day it's some city or county, another day it's a different government agency, all getting ransomware. So we're also seeing this more frequently generally in our customer base. We've been engaged in multiple instances to help with remediation efforts after a ransomware attack. So we have to ask the question, what's behind the trend? Why is this occurring more frequently? Ransomware is not new. It's been around for over 3 decades. There's a couple factors that can contribute to this. One is public sector organizations, for many different reasons. These are considered more favorable targets to attackers. Reason being, they often host valuable data, data that contains PHI, PII. These are all hot commodities in the criminal marketplace. Another reason is that public sector organizations, they have limited resources, and oftentimes they have subpar defenses compared to private sector organizations. And lastly, many public sector organizations, they provide an essential service. This service being offline can really have a serious impact, including loss of life. Attackers, they realize this, and they realize the urgency to bring these systems back online. Another factor is that ransomware presents an inscrutable problem to the victim. It's based on asymmetric key encryption. It's the same technology that protects your data when you're using HTTPS. And finally, the last point here is the widespread use of cryptocurrency allows ransom collection to be anonymous, essentially risk-free. So you take all these factors and what you get is a thriving market. We're seeing ransomware as a service being offered in criminal watering holes. You provide payment to the bad actors. They do all the work for you, and you just simply wait for the ransom payments to pour in. And usually that's anonymously to your cryptocurrency wallet. So let's take a minute or two to talk about the ways that infection can take place. And on the next slide, we'll discuss the anatomy of an attack and some of the tools we can use to mitigate the attack. So the main vector here is no surprise here. It's phishing. I know we've gone through or conducted training to our user base to avoid the classic cases. You get an email saying, "Dear Mr. Customer, we've detected fraudulent activity on your account. Please click here to log in to verify your recent transaction." Just an example there of a phishing attempt. Some of the less common vectors include a legitimate website or application. Oftentimes it's compromised, unbeknown to the user and even its owner. So attackers can then probe the user's web-based applications for vulnerabilities and can deploy the ransomware payload to infect the host. So here we're going to look at the anatomy or phases of a ransomware attack and map each phase to a solution that we can leverage to mitigate the attack. So the attack progresses from left to right, beginning with the initial user action. And this can be the user clicks on a link in an email, they click on a malicious ad, or they open a malicious email attachment. All these actions, they can lead to communication with malicious infrastructure. So if we look at the diagram here, we can see there's a few solutions that can block communication with the malicious infrastructure. The first one being umbrella. Now, this is the top level defense. This is a DNS security tool. It blocks DNS resolutions to malicious domains. Basically, if the host is initiating a conversation to malicious infrastructure, it first sends out a DNS resolution request. Umbrella gets that request and determines if the requested domain is malicious or benign. If it's benign, it returns the IP of the domain. If it's malicious, it simply returns a block page. Email security, that's a critical part in this kill chain. It blocks the transmission of the malicious link. It can also block the transmission of the malicious attachment here as well. Another layer of protection we get is from the next generation firewall. It adds another layer of security by blocking the transmission of the ransomware payload to the host. This is often done by the IPS module. So next in our hypothetical scenario here, let's say all the previous blocks were not applied for whatever reason, and the call out to malicious infrastructure, it was successful. And now we have the ransomware payload. It's been downloaded onto the host. And this is where the EDR kicks in, the endpoint detection and response solution. This prevents the execution of the ransomware. And in the event it's actually been executed, it can also prevent lateral movement and any additional malicious activity as well. And the final step on the very right, we see umbrella kick in again. Here it prevents the communication to the encryption key infrastructure by again applying a DNS block. So one thing that I do want to mention here with the Cisco solutions is the tight integration. We also have Cisco Talos, which is really serving as the lifeblood for these solutions. If you guys aren't familiar with Talos, it's basically a global security research provider that provides the data that the Cisco security products, they use this data to take action. So number one, it provides a really high level of protection, but also number two, the ability to conduct efficient threat hunting and also threat response. We'll talk a little bit more about this with SecureX on the next slide. So there was a lot going on this slide, but if we take a step back and we look at this process as a whole again, we see that disrupting any portion of this process stops the attack. It's a good example of having a layered approach and an in-depth and defense strategy. These are considered best practices and really critical to maintain a strong security posture. So here we're going to focus on a few points that are not directly related to the attack itself, but they allow us to prop up our defenses a little bit further. So again, given some of the limited resources that public sector organizations have, efficiency is really the name of the game here. What we really want is we want a tool that can collect event data from multiple products, provide analysis of that data, and then provide efficiencies that act on that data. Whether it's automation or accelerated threat response. And so to fill that gap, Cisco's offering, Cisco's offering in the XDR space is something called SecureX. It's not a SIM or it's not a SOAR product. Doesn't require a lot of calibration and it's cloud-based, so deployment is really simplified. Last week, Russ had talked a little bit about network segmentation, with scalable group tags or SGTs using DNA Center and ICE. That's definitely one way to skin the cat. The important goal here is we limit lateral movement and we prevent unnecessary communication between the hosts in the organization. And the last 2 points really go hand in hand. If we think about one of the prevalent threats again, exploit kits and how they operate, it makes sense for us to deploy tools that manage vulnerabilities and also remediation for those vulnerabilities. So let's switch gears a bit and talk about credential compromise. Until we achieve the holy grail of widespread use of passwordless authentication, this is going to be a problem we're going to be battling with continuously. As you can see here, 80% of breaches involve some type of credential compromise. We see breaches happen more frequently. I'm sure you guys are hearing about them in the news. This in turn is going to compound the likelihood of compromised credentials which then again leads to additional breaches. You see where this is going. It's just feeding the vicious cycle. So what are some ways that we can use to protect us from credential compromise? One is PAM, or privileged access management. Another tool is multi-factor authentication. So when we're adding these solutions, we're significantly increasing the difficulty for the attacker. These guys, they're always looking for the path of least resistance, and increasing the level of effort required for a successful attack. It gives them a good reason to move on to a more favorable target. So let's do a quick overview of PAM, or privileged access management. The goal here is simply to prevent the malicious use of privileged credentials such as password and SSH keys. When an attacker has access to these privileged accounts, they really have the keys to the kingdom. We're also enforcing here the concept of least privilege by configuring the appropriate policies in the PAM. And this example topology, this is a cloud-based solution. The web portal is basically acting as a proxy to access resources to a privileged account. A critical part of the solution is updating the privileged credentials at a regular interval or on demand, depending on the policy. And last but not least, equally important is the isolation and monitoring of privileged sessions to prevent lateral movement of malware. And we have another tool in our toolkit, and that's MFA, or multi-factor authentication. This follows the what do you know, which is your password, and what do you have. And this is typically your cell phone. And you combine these factors to protect authentications. We can add protections to many use cases and applications. Some of the common ones are remote access VPN. This is your AnyConnect. This is your Global Protect. We see many organizations add MFA to their Windows user login. They add MFA to network device logins. For example, they protect their critical infrastructure, like their core switches, their routers, their perimeter firewalls, etc. We also see application of MFA in SaaS applications, for example, O365 and Salesforce. So last thing I want to touch on today is not specifically a public sector trend, but a general trend that's being accelerated by the pandemic. Typically in an organization, traffic flow it's typically centralized. It flows from the central office to a branch office and vice versa. What we're seeing these days is we're seeing that model transition to more of a distributed model. And this is due to more employees working at home. So what does this do for us? It presents us with a few challenges. We increase the attack surface dramatically. And so we need to provide a security stack to these users that accommodates for this. So SASE is an architecture that it's not a product, it's an architecture that presents a solution to this problem. It's basically saying we're going to provide security as a service. And we can apply this in a couple of use cases. So when we take the use case again of the remote worker that's off net, quote unquote off net, not in the organizational security stack purview, we can still apply corporate-based policies to this user. And this comes in the form of DNS layer protection and a web proxy. So again, using Umbrella, the host initiates a conversation by requesting a DNS resolution. This is either blocked or allowed based upon the disposition of the domain. And we can also apply a web proxy that adds another layer of additional protection to filter content and also malicious web resources. The other use case applies to multi-office organizations. So let's say, for example, you are a county DPW or you're a school district, and you typically have a central site and you have private circuits to all your branch sites. You're backhauling all your internal internet traffic to the central sites, and you have performance issues. That's really pushing organizations to install DIAs at their branch sites. But this leaves a security hole. You either have to stand up some type of security stack at every single location or alleviate that pressure somehow. By leveraging SASE, you can create a tunnel from each branch site to the cloud security stack provider. This provides a firewall as a service along with the DNS and the web proxy protection. So if you guys recall misconfiguration and misdelivery, that was a big part of the threat landscape, and having a centralized policy configuration and policy application can really reduce that threat considerably. So I want to end today's session with a quick recap. Threats are only going to increase in the public sector space. Public sector organizations, they're just too attractive for attackers, and it's imperative for us to prepare for these attacks. Secondly, with limited resources with limited access to resources, public sector organizations, we need to maximize efficiency. So selecting the right tools and also integration points is really critical. And lastly, we've only scratched the surface of the capabilities of the Cisco security portfolio. We're really excited to show you more and happy to explore how these solutions can address some of your security concerns.